All right, so we've been going over a challenge from our curriculum page. So it's the React Mute Button challenge. We've linked it from today, which is March 29th. There's not much description on this page either. Again, it's creating a React app and adding some functionality, but we'll walk through it together. So we have a lot of the code kind of posted here. I'm gonna type it out so we can kind of get that practice. But the goal of this challenge is to create a simple button that can toggle back and forth between showing a mute icon and an unmuted icon. And we can maybe add on from there if we have anything we want to add. All right, so I already have my server running. I downloaded the challenge. I did a create React app, and I have my server running now. So I'm here at my default React page. So let's get started and kind of go through this a little quickly because we have created React apps before. So I'm going to go to my source folder, go to app.js, and get rid of all the garbage that I don't want. So this can go away. Don't need this logo. That can go away. And delete this. Okay, so app.js now has nothing on it. Let's add a nice title for our application. So I like using H2 tags. Let's call this our mute button app. And then as always, our lovely horizontal rule. Okay, so we have that in place. Let's figure out what else we need to do. So we want to show a button. So let's add the button right here. And then say toggle mute, we'll call that button. And then we want to add some event handler for this button, right? Buttons alone don't do anything. We need to tap into the on-click event. So that's going to call some event handler here. So let's add some more logic, render, and event handlers. All right, so on-click should call some function for us. So we're going to define that function here. We'll call this toggle mute. Okay, and then this will do some action for us. So again, as we talked about, if you read the README, our goal here is to kind of toggle back and forth between two different states. So that's telling me I'm probably gonna need some state value, keeping track of are we on or off in terms of muted. So I'll add states here. I wanna create a state value. In order to do that for a functional component, I need to import our great friend useState from React. All right, so now that we have imported useState, we should be able to use that here. We'll do const, we'll say is muted. Normal naming conventions for Booleans, usually you want to ask a question, so like is or has or whatever that implies it has one of two states. So say set is muted. And this is going to be a Boolean. So again, Boolean is just used for two states. So we have true or false. We'll say initially we're going to not be muted. So false is initial value for is muted. And we'll use that in some capacity here. But now that we have the state value, when we click this button, we're going to call toggle mute, the function. And toggle mute will basically flip the value of is muted. So let's add new is muted equals not is muted. All right, so this will flip the state and give us the new value. And then we want to maybe console log. Let's just see what that value is. So say new state of is muted. All right, and then we want to obviously set the state value. So we do that by calling the updating function. So again, hopefully we're getting comfortable with using state values. So I need to call the updating function and not directly update my state value because we know that leads to bad things. In this case, I'll pass new is muted. All right, so let's check this out. Let's make sure that all the wiring is set. So again, we have a button. When we click that button, it should call this function. This function should take the current state of is muted, get the opposite value by negating it, and then we want to print it out and then set that new state value. All right, so let's actually see if our console log shows us what we expect. Looks like I got some errors because new is muted does not have that let that I want. All right, cool. So again, terminal will show errors if we have any. Let's go back here. All right, this is what our app looks like. Nothing too exciting. but we have something bringing printout to our console. This is interesting, but don't know what that is. Toggle mutes. All right, so the new state is true. If I click this again, that should change the false. So yep, false, true, false, true. All right, so this is going to be our toggle button, changing a state value between true and false each time. So that looks like that's wired up correctly. All right, now I'm just going to kind of automatically jump to creating a component just to kind of expedite things. So I want to create not just a button here, but I want to create a component that could render, that's going to render a button. So as always, going to create a function or folder called components. In there, I'm going to create a new component and call that mute button, button.js. All right, so let's create a quick functional component. So function mute button. Might take in props. Again, if I don't use them, that's fine. And then I want to return some JSX. So this is going to be my button. Let's put my safety divs around. And then app.js had a button. Copy that over to my mute button. All right, so my mute button component is going to render a button HTML element. We're going to want to, let's see. So on click, we still need to call something. That's probably going to be a prop value. Let's see, toggle mutes. All right, so let's export this from here. So export default mute button. Now that we've allowed an export here, we should be able to import it in app.js. So here I'll go import it. Say components that we're using, import mute button from that location. All right, so VS Code had my back there. Put the correct file path. Now we should be able to render a mute button. Okay, so again, our state value is going to be here. But in this case, again, we could move the state value into mute button, but again, that's kind of a design decision. What if we want to use this for something else? Like maybe we had a display that says muted or not. We'll figure that out. But we have mute button that's going to toggle our state. So let's figure out how to get that working. So we need to pass some props down a mute button so that when it's clicked, it can respond to something. Let's see. Is that what I want to do? Toggle mutes. Okay, so we want to know if it's muted. So is muted is going to be a prop value that is set to our state value. So now anytime this changes, this entire component will be re-rendered. Okay, and then we also want to add another prop value. So again, we could add as many prop values as you want. So in this case, we'll call it toggle mute. Set that equal to toggle mute. So again, names are going to be the same. That's usually the way I will name props, just match the state values. So we have is muted, toggle mute. That's a function. So now we have two prop values that we can use in our child component. In this case, I'm going to change this to props.toggleMute. And then what do I want to do here? I think we want to change this. So we want to show if it's on or off. So I'm going to change this to be, I'm going to use a ternary operator. So this is kind of something that saves writing, instead of writing an if statement. So we talked about this briefly, and let's talk about it more. I cannot write an if statement right here. So let's say I put curly braces to write some JavaScript. The way JSX works, I cannot write if props dot is muted, you know, give me some string, let's say off, else on. This doesn't work in JSX. So we have two options here. We create a new function and say return, I'm sorry, render button text, and call this function and return whatever we need to. Make that arrow function. All right, so one option is create a new function, write that if statement in here, and then return what we want. So return that or return that. And since we are just using that as text, we can return text here. So this would work because we're calling a function. This is a one-line expression. This would work. So let's actually see how this works and make sure it actually does work. All right. So we have props toggle mute. Props is muted. Okay, let's see if that's wired up correctly. So again, we're passing two props to mute button. One is a function that's going to be called to simply flip a state. And the second is going to be the actual state that's getting flipped. So again, we could move the state value down if we don't need to use the state value in app.js, but we will be using it. So let's keep it in app.js. All right, so we have this button. If I click it, notice it switches to on, off. So that is working just like I want it to, right? It's toggling and actually toggling text. So that's cool. Output here, don't really care about that. Okay, that works. That's cool. Now what do we want to do? So as we talked about in mute button, we couldn't write this if statement in here. So we had to create a new function for it. In this case, there's an easy way to do it. So this is where we talk about one-line expressions and why these are really beneficial to know about and use them in React. So here, instead of writing a function, I can use a ternary operator. A ternary statement is a one-line, kind of a single line if statement. So instead of doing an if else, I can make this really simple and just say, all right, what's the value of is muted? Question mark. The question mark is the true case. So if is muted is true, give me off. If it's not true, give me on. All right, so this is a one-line expression. So this is valid in JSX. So I don't need this function at all. I could just get rid of it. Bye-bye function. Obviously, this is taking a fair amount of space. I've explicitly put this on new lines just to make it easier to read. Again, true case, false case. We can see that this works. Nothing's changed here, still works. But again, these are really easy to kind of condense onto one line. So again, the formatting is your choice, but you could theoretically just put this all in one line, and it's super easy to write and read, and it saves space. Again, space isn't a huge concern, but always good to not use extra space if you don't need to. So again, I can put this all in one line, and there we go. This is a one-line if statement, and this is why we want to get familiar with using ternary statements. I saw a hand raised. I missed who that was. Jesse.
Yes. The question I have is just to reiterate. So on the app.js page, that is muted equals is muted and toggle mute equals toggle mute. That is in reference to your component mute button for the props dot is muted, correct?
Correct. Yeah, the name on this side is how the child refers to that value. This is just the value we're setting. Again, and usually I will name my prop value the same as like the state value, just to keep it consistent, but you don't have to. So hopefully you understand the distinction that this is my choice of naming. This is restricted to whatever I named my state values or my state, value and function.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Was there another hand up there?
Yeah, I want to ask about the toggle mute and how you have the toggle mute function there. Can you just write within the brackets? Can't you just write set is muted is equal to not is muted?
Right here?
No, the one below it. Because like your toggle mute has like 4 lines of code, but couldn't it just be 1 line of code where, because set is muted is just already a function, right?
Yes.
And you could just write exclamation mark is muted, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I was just making sure. I didn't understand why we had the toggle mute function there.
Yeah, the reason I did this was I wanted to console log something, but technically we could do this all in one line. Again, let's just practice anonymous functions. So if I didn't want to console log, or even if I did, I could write this all in one place, but usually you want to use anonymous functions for functions that are pretty small. So let's say we just didn't want to do any of this logic. I could just create a function right here and say, all right, anonymous function, what do you want to do? I want to set is muted is going to be not the current state of muted. Yep. If that's all we want to do, I'd probably write an anonymous function instead of creating a brand new function for it. But in this case, I wanted to console log and show what the new value was and also set is muted. So again, design decisions, you could write all this logic in an anonymous function here. But I usually, if I have more than one line, usually I will not opt for that unless whatever. Sometimes I waver on that. Yeah, this would work. Just create a function here to do the work we want. Still should work. Yep, still works. So we have, some text that I added in here just so I could use that state value in app. So, we could do another ternary statement here. We don't need another state value. We rely on this state value to determine what our text is going to be. So again, ternary statements really get to use. So is muted. We'll just say currently muted. Else we'll say, oops, I need a string though. Can't get around that. We're currently muted. Otherwise, we're currently not muted. Whatever. We need a curly brace. All right. So again, ternary statements, really simple to do if statements within JSX. Again, you don't have to use them. You create a function, write your if statements, but I'd argue this is much simpler just to write an if statement kind of in a single line. All right, so if we do this, we're currently muted. We want to turn that off. We're on. All right, cool, that toggles. What if we didn't want to show this, right? So let's say when we're muted, we want to show currently muted. If we're not muted, let's say we want to show nothing at all. We can easily do that by doing empty string here. But the thing is, maybe I want to do this a different way. But this is still going to show like an empty string text. Specifically, it's going to show this element. This paragraph element, even if it has nothing in it, is still going to exist in the DOM. Well, that isn't a big deal. What if I don't want this entire node to exist if I have nothing? So I could change that to move this paragraph to be in here. So now if I'm muted, I actually show an element. So the difference with this now is if we're muted, a new element gets added to the DOM. If we're not, nothing gets added. And this is better because why have empty elements that aren't going to do anything, which I know is kind of contradictory when I add divs all the time. But in this case, we can conditionally show an entire element if they based on some conditions. So if I do it this way, I got a warning. Oh, because I don't use this function. Fine. You can go away. All right, so now notice that we have no text here. There's no element here. If I look in the property inspector and go to elements, go through roots, again, there's some levels to go through here. App, div, notice there's no paragraph element here. But when I click this button, notice that a new paragraph element got added to the DOM. So that's what React's doing. It's actually adding and removing items from your DOM as needed. So I'm currently muted. I guess I have quotes that I don't need. But if I take that away, notice that entire element gets removed. It's not just hidden, it doesn't exist. All right, so that is conditional rendering, something we can make use of. So again, why have extra elements that you don't need? So this is one way you can conditionally render an element where you actually have an element that's returned from a ternary or return nothing at all. So this could also be null. That's usually what I prefer. But another way you can write this, this isn't wrong, but one way you might see this written also is this way. It's doing the same thing essentially. It's a little weird to look at, so let me make that a new line. This is kind of doing combinational logic. I guess I don't need those quotes here. What this is saying is it's going to evaluate from left to right, meaning it's going to check if this is true. Only then is it going to evaluate this portion. If this happens to be false, so if is muted is false, it's not even going to check this part because the and says both sides had to be true. So the first part is true, only then will the second part effectively exist. So in this case, again, you might see this in some code. Hopefully you're not freaked out by it. You just understand it's evaluating the first part and then kind of evaluating the second part only if the first part is true. So this will do the same exact thing where this node or this element will only be added if is muted is true. So if I leave this as is, again, this should have updated. Notice that stuff is being added and removed. So I get my paragraph currently is muted. And if I click off, that paragraph element no longer exists down here. All right, so that's the idea of conditional rendering. Definitely take advantage of it to make sure you're not just having a bunch of empty elements that aren't doing anything in certain cases. Any questions about that? Okay, I think the last thing we need to do was load in some images. So if we looked at our challenge, where'd that go? We have some icons. We want to render the on.svg image when we're actually on, as in when muted. And when we're not muted, we want to show the off icon. All right, so that should be relatively straightforward. I did make an update to the image files because there's something wrong with them based on what Ivan said. So I have those image files up here. It's going to relocate those down to my source folder. And then I want to import them. So I'll import them in my mute button component. I'll do import on icon from, and I got to find it. So it's level up icon / on. And then I'll import the off icon. Oops. All right, so we have two icons. We can just use this kind of as is. So instead of having a button, what if we showed an image inside the button? So we're showing text right now. Text is cool, but what's cooler than text? Images. So let's do a ternary statement here and say, if props.is muted, right? We have a prop value coming from the parent that is called is muted. That's going to be a Boolean, which we kind of expect. Now we could show either an image that has a source of let's see, if it's muted, we want to show the opposite icons. We want to show the off icon. And then probably close this right here. Otherwise, we want to show the on icon. So there's several ways we could do this. This is one way. On icon. Let's see if this works. Oops, 2 question marks. All right, so this will show either an image that has the on off icon or on icon. The sizing is going to be weird. I wasn't able to fix the sizing on these images. So it's going to look kind of off sizing wise, but hopefully that works. What happened here? Did I not update these icons? That's where I did. Hey, those are not the right icons. So it looks like I have not checked out the latest copy. Apologies for that. So again, the current version on mute button should have the correct images. Looks like I did not copy those down. So let me get those quickly. That's going to be a pain. All right, I'm going to have to copy it locally. All right, so this is a incorrect format. It's some old format, so I had to update it to get this to work. That's something that I have not adopted. So let me just quickly fix that. Sorry for the errors here. So again, the current version online for mute button should have the correct images. I just had an earlier copy that had the wrong file stuff. All right. So I'm not sure how the sizing works. I need to mess with that with SVGs. I'm not an expert on SVGs, but with the correct images, your application should work. And then if I go here, all right. So again, size is ridiculously large. Hopefully you guys can deal with it. But the icon is the main feature here. So these are the SVG files that are being used. So if I click this, notice I get, we're currently muted. If I want to toggle that on, I could do that. This is the correct state. So we're currently muted, which means we're not, I think we might want to flip these images. Like this should be the reverse of what we want to do, right? But we're currently muted. If we want to unmute, this should be, I guess that's fine. So we're muted right now. If we want to unmute, we click this and we go to, we could hear stuff or say stuff. All right, so we got our toggle working with images. Another way we could write this, instead of having 2 separate images, we could kind of do this ternary inside an image component. So I could have image source and do the ternary in here, which I would prefer, because that's the only difference between these 2 lines, right? It's which image we're using. So my source can have a ternary that says, all right, props is muted. Great, which icon do you want to use? Off or on? All right, and that makes my code, I think, simpler to read. So we'll get rid of that. There we go. Again, another use of ternary just makes it much easier than writing a separate function that you need to call. All right, so let's make sure we didn't break anything there. All right, refresh. Okay, Cool, seems works. Nothing too crazy going on here. Any questions about this challenge here? And hopefully this felt familiar enough with, we've done a couple of React challenges already. So this one wasn't too bad, I would say. Pretty easy to get it working. Elaine, question?
Just curiosity. Does the ampersand can be used as ternary operator in some situation?
Yeah, so you can do that if you only want that's conditional rendering. So in this case, if I did it this way, this is not quite the same thing. This is saying only show the off icon when we're muted, otherwise show nothing. So there'll be no source here. So the difference here, the on icon is not part of this equation anymore. This is saying, given one condition, do this. If the condition is not true, don't do this. Versus what I had before is a little different. This is saying, if some condition is true, do one thing. If the condition is not true, do another thing. So you want to use ternaries when you have two cases. You want to use the and version, the conditional rendering, when you only want to show one, when you want to show something or not show that one thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So again, I just want you guys to be familiar with this this design of using ampersands. But in this case, we need to use a ternary because we have two distinct cases we want to show, which is on or off. Okay, that's pretty much all we had to do with that challenge. So I think that was, again, pretty straightforward, I would say. But now let's actually get into the new material for today, which is class-based components. So I want to touch upon that. And then if we have more time, we'll talk about using map and filter. Those are good to know about, but I want to make sure we get to class-based components. So let's talk about class-based components. So far, we have been only creating functional components. As you might have noticed, we're creating functions, and these are our components. These are known as functional-based components, and this is one way you can create components in React. Now, again, this is kind of annoying that, yes, there are two different ways to achieve the same exact thing. And the question you might have is, well, why do we need to learn both? And the answer to that is, well, you might encounter class-based components or functional-based components, depending on, some legacy project that you overtake. If it was written like several years ago, it's likely to be class-based components because that was the standard back then. More recently, people are adopting functional-based components, and this is kind of a design decision based on the creators of React. They decided that they want to move towards functional-based components and move away from class-based components, but we're kind of in a transitory state. So you're probably going to see both at times, depending on, again, if it's an older project, you might see class-based components. Newer projects hopefully will be adopting functional-based components, but you should be familiar with both ways of creating components. So for our curriculum, we're going to be mostly focused on functional-based components because that is the future. But it is important to know how to create and how to kind of work with class-based components also. So again, yes, it's going to be kind of annoying to learn, a brand new way of writing the same thing, but hopefully you guys can kind of get along with it. All right, how do we want to do this? Let's take a quick segue. I'm going to create a new file, and that new file is going to be called, let's call it donuts.js. I'm lacking a better name. I'm going to create another file and call it donuts.py. All right, so we're going to take a quick trip down memory lane. I know we went through this through OOP week, where Raphael went through talking about OOP in JavaScript. But I just want to make sure we understand kind of the way JavaScript and Python classes look. So I think we are, hopefully everyone agrees, we're kind of familiar with working with Python classes because we use them a lot. So if I go to my Python file, I'm just going to dump in some code from the curriculum page, kind of see what this looks like. Looks like I have some tabbing issues. That needs to be tabbed. So we are in Python, so white space does matter. So I have some simple classes here. I want to make sure we understand, again, this is Python, so hopefully nothing too unfamiliar. We have a class called person. Inside of there, we have an init method. If you guys remember, the init method is like is the initializer method. It's automatically called when we create an instance. And then we also have a student class. In this case, we're using inheritance. So hopefully you guys have not forgotten about inheritance. In this case, our student class is inheriting from the person class. So in this case, it means everything that person has, in this case, first name, last name, and even this method will be available to students, and student can add on from there. Looks like I have a typo here, so this should be first name, last name. I'm gonna clean that up on the page, but all right, so again, our person just has first name and last name. Our student additionally has student ID that it's storing. So here, if we create a new student, we could pass it an ID, first name, last name. These two pieces of information are stored on person. The additional student information is stored on the student level, but we have access to anything from person or from students. Notice when we print out our information, we can access student ID from the student level. We can call get full name, which exists in the person level, because this is inherited into students. So we have access to get full name, even though it's in a person, in the person class. All right, so again, that's basic, OOP classes in Python. Let's compare that with what JavaScript would look like. Again, it's very similar, some syntactical differences. So let's drop that into donuts.js and do a split screen, because that's always fun. Let's get rid of all the space. All right, so we have, these are the two same classes, just in different languages. So on the left over here, we have JavaScript. On the right, we have our familiar Python. So just to compare and contrast, let's look at OOP creating classes in JavaScript. So here, we use the same keyword of class. We define the name of the class, again, same naming conventions. The first difference we encounter is this constructor method. Oops, sorry, I have the same file twice. All right, so Python on the left, JavaScript on the right. Sorry about that. All right, so we have this constructor method right here. This is akin to the init method that we're familiar with in Python. So notice that we must call it constructor. That is the same rule that we have with init, must be underscore underscore init underscore underscore in Python. For JavaScript, we must create a method called constructor. That is not a naming choice. That is a mandatory naming convention if you want to have something initialized. In the constructor, we pass it whatever values we want to pass into it, just like we did for an init method. The one caveat or one difference being we don't need to pass in this magical self value. That is not required for JavaScript. But there's still a similar reference variable. In that case, instead of self, it's called this. Like literally this is a reserved keyword. So I don't need to pass it in here, right? I'm not passing this in here like here. Unlike in Python where we had to pass in self, we do not and should not pass in this to our constructor. It's already exists and we have access to it automatically. But we do the same thing. We attach some information. So in this case, we're attaching the first name to an instance attribute called first name and last name. Pretty much the same we're doing with the self keyword in Python. We also have a method. Again, same rules apply for instance methods. We do not need to pass in that self keyword or this keyword. Do not have to pass that in. We have access to it automatically. We don't have to pass it in, unlike Python, where we do need to pass in self for every instance method. So that's a key difference between Python classes and JavaScript classes. All right, but otherwise looks pretty similar. Again, we have methods, we have attributes, nothing different there. When we use inheritance, that is slightly different syntax. So notice in JavaScript, we need to use the extends keyword and then whatever class we want to extend. So in this case, we want to extend the person keyword, meaning students can inherit from person. But otherwise, it's the same concept that we saw in Python, where we're using inheritance. So this means, sure I have all these typos. This means that student will inherit everything that person has, and then student can add on top of that. So here, we're calling down to the base class. Again, there is a super method in JavaScript as there is a super method in Python, but they're used a little differently. So in this case, we just call super and pass it whatever parameters we want to. And we store any additional parameters for the student level as a student attribute. The one last key difference is how we create an instance. So in Python, we simply call the class and pass it the values. In JavaScript, we need to use this new keyword. Otherwise, call the class and pass the values. But don't forget your new keyword. That is the key difference for JavaScript when you're creating an instance of a class. Otherwise, everything else is the same. we can access attributes, call functions, just like before. All right, so again, that should be a refresher. We covered this back in OOP week. We want to make sure we didn't forget that. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about class-based components. But before I get to that, I want to pause here, make sure there's no questions or confusion about anything we talked about for classes in JavaScript. Any questions? Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about class-based components. We're gonna go back to our mute button example. Donuts can go away. Let's go back to our app.js. And we also had our component. So what we have right now are functional-based components. It's a function. This is our component. That's what we have. But class-based components are just another way to create components, but they do exactly the same thing that functional-based components do. So we're familiar with how we create components using functions. Now our next step is just kind of understand, if we wanted to use class-based components, what changes do we need to make to do that? Again, effectively, the application is not going to change. It's going to have the same behavior. I'm not going to notice, again, I'm looking at this application. To me as a user, I'm not going to know, and I don't care if it's been implemented by functional-based components or class-based components. I'm going to get the same functionality no matter what. All right, so ideally this should not change one bit. But in the code, what if we want to use class-based components? What do we need to change to accomplish that? So we're going to walk through the steps and make sure we understand how to do that. So the first thing is, let's write some notes down here. We want to import components from React. So this is a base class that we're going to inherit from and extend to create our own components. So to do that, we're going to import components from React. So I guess that got autofilled. I could do that right here too. I can import multiple items like this. But in fact, I'm just going to kind of get ahead of myself. We don't need to use state anymore. This is actually going to go away. So I'm just going to delete that. So instead, we're going to inherit, or we're going to import component, which is a class, and we're going to extend here. So that's step one, import component. Maybe we should do it split screen so I don't have to scroll so much. Let's get class-based components. All right, we'll take notes and do split screen. Hopefully you guys are up for that. All right, so notes over there, changes on our left side. All right, so step one was imports components from React. All right, so now that we have access to this component class, we need to use that here. So step two is going to be convert right? So we have a function here. We now want to use a class here. So instead of having function, I'm going to change this to class. And then I'm going to extend the component class. So again, this is a base class. Component is a base class. And I'm adding functionality with my own component here. So that's how we change our function heading into a class heading. Step three, we need to kind of change some of the stuff here. Notice that I'm getting a lot of red lines here. That's because I need to convert a few more things here. So as one thing I mentioned is states, we no longer need to use state. So convert state values to use state. Right, so use state, it no longer exists. We're not going to use that for class-based components, but we still have the concept of states for class-based components. The magic here is we must use a variable called state. Right, and that's going to be an object, also known as a dictionary. So to be clear, must be named state. So this is kind of like a reserved variable name for React purposes. It's not a magic variable for JavaScript, but React is specifically going to look for a variable called state within your component. All right, in here, we're going to create key value pairs of all the state variables that we want. So in this case, we had a single state variable. So this will become a key of is muted, and then whatever value I want that to be set to. All right, so this was our old functional way. We can keep that around maybe. Functional way. This is our new class way. So we create a state variable, must be named state. It's going to be an object that's going to have every single state value that we want. In this case, we have one, but if we had more, like donuts was one, we could say, yummy. As many state values as you want, we just create all the values in one single state object. All right, so that was step 3, convert all your state values to use a state object. Next, oops, I have a typo there. Next, what do we need to do? So we had state values converted. Next, we need to update our return value. So for our class, we need to create a method, create render method. Type all this. All right, so this was our return value from our function. We need to create an explicit render method that's going to return exactly what we're returning. So it's not too hard. We just wrap our return statement inside of a function. So this must be named render. All right, so these are requirements, not, it's not names I'm just making up. You must have a function called render inside of your component. If you do not, it's not a complete component. You're probably going to get errors if you don't have a render method. So this, I put all of the logic that I wanted to render just inside my render method. So that's creating my render method. Step 5, and this might be step 4 in some cases, converts all references to state values to use this dot state. All right, so I have some state values here, right? If you guys remember, is muted was a state value, also is muted right here. I need to convert this. This function no longer exists. If you remember, this was my updating function that came from use state. I no longer have that function around. So we need to do things a little differently when we're using class-based components. So to convert some of these values, a state value right here becomes this dot state dot is muted. So again, this is a magic keyword that exists that's referring to the instance of this component that we're using. So this is a reference to the current component dot state. Oops. This dot state is referring to the state object that we have created for a component. And then dot is muted is referring to the entry with a key of is muted. It's going to give us back this value. So we need to go through all of our code. In this case, I have this dot state is muted right here, also right here. This dot state dot is muted. So I'm accessing my state value in my class-based component appropriately. But then the question becomes, well, what happens to the updating function? Question is, can we just modify our state value directly? Nope, that rule still holds. You should not directly modify state and prop values. So we still need to have some way to update the state value. I guess there should be this dot state that is muted also. But there's no function that we have created because useState was never called. Instead, there's a pre-existing function that is specifically named setState. Let's add more comments. Must call setState. This is a function that exists, not a function we created, not a function we named. So we must call this function, and it's called setState. And we have to pass a dictionary to setState. setState. We pass it the value you want to update. So in this case, I want to update is muted. And then the value I want to set to. So it's like I'm passing in a new dictionary. Let's break this up into several lines. All right, so I'm passing setState a dictionary right here. It's going to break this into many, many lines. All right, so setState is taking in a dictionary. That dictionary has a key and the new value I want to set that state value to. Okay, so in this case, I don't need quotes everywhere. Get rid of those. Is muted and don't. Quotes optional. So in this case, I have is muted and I want to set the new value. So that's what setState takes. It's basically a new object or a new dictionary with your new value in it. The important thing I want to mention here, I have two state values, right? I have donuts and I have is muted. I only want to update is muted. The question is, well, is this dictionary going to replace this entire dictionary? Is my donuts value going to be like wiped out? The answer is no. setState is going to know exactly what I want to update. If I don't have donuts in the dictionary I'm passing it or the object I'm passing it, this will be left alone. This won't be modified. It won't be wiped out. Donuts and yummy, that value will be retained. So only what you want to update is what you pass in this new object that you're passing as that state. Any questions? So maybe add some bullet points here. 5A, state values, say donuts, state value becomes this dot state dot donuts, and the set donuts updating function becomes set state. Again, must be set state. We pass a dictionary of donuts and very yummy, whatever new value is. All right, hopefully my notes aren't terrible, but that's the idea here. So again, update the state values and the state updating functions to use this dot state and, oops, I need a this here. Where'd that go? This needs to be this dot set state. So again, all of these functions are coming from the instance. That's why we need to use this everywhere. The set state is not a magic function that exists anywhere. It's coming from component. Component has functionality for set state and everything else that this is referring to. Okay, so that was step 5. We did step 4. I think that's all we need to do. So again, import component from React, convert your function heading to use a class heading. So class, whatever your name of your component is, extends component. Create a state object for all your state values. Go through your file. So I'm gonna make that step 4. That's probably next thing you want to do here. All right, so convert all of your state references to use this dot state and use this dot set state appropriately. Excuse me. All right, and then the last thing is you want to take everything you're returning from your function and just wrap it in a render method because it's got to be part of a render method. Any questions about what we've done so far? And it's very procedural. Again, it's accomplishing the same thing. We just have different kind of structures and syntax for a class-based component. I'm going to kind of condense this back down. All right, that's good enough. All right, we have one more case we haven't covered, and we're going to explore that with our mute button. So let's go to our mute button. Where did mute button go? Right here. All right, so we want to convert this to a class-based component. Again, there's not as much to convert. We don't have any state values, so step 4 doesn't apply. We also have, I guess, step 5 will be right here. Converts all prop references to this dot props dot whatever. All right, so we have props, but we need to change our header here. So let's do the same steps that we did before. One is import component components from React. All right, next we need to change our function heading to be a class mute button. Extends that base component class. All right, and then we need to go through, all right, we did step 1, we did step 2. We don't have any state values, so we don't need to create a state object. We don't have anything to convert here, but we do have props. So in this case, we're using props that came from our parent. Notice that we don't capture the props in our class heading, but there's magic behind the scene in that we have access to props kind of automatically through our instance. So if I do this dot props, that should give me access to the instance, and that automatically has a props object. Similar to how a state object needs to be created, a props object kind of automatically is created by the component class. This function, this class where he has a props object that's going to get the right data inserted into it. It's still an object, so I'm still going to access the right way, but I need to go through the this keyword because this refers to the instance of the class that we are using. So I did step 5. Step 6, we need to create a render method. So again, whatever I'm returning right here, simple enough. I just create a render method. and then wrap my entire return statement with that. And that's all I need to do for this component. So that was really quick. Again, the main change here was my prop values need to be this dot props, whatever my prop values were. One thing that you probably notice is that I'm not using a function keyword here. In fact, if I do use it, I'll get an error. This is just some syntax restrictions with what React is using. So I can't, I can't use the function keyword. You just kind of omit those. It's implied that this is a function. You don't use the function keyword. I believe, and I'm not 100% on this, but I think I've looked this up. The reason for that is if you go to index.js, there's something called strict mode. This strict mode has stronger, stronger restrictions for your syntax. If you got rid of strict mode, you have more leniency in how you use JavaScript, and JavaScript is pretty flexible with its syntax sometimes. Strict mode is saying you need to use a particular type of syntax for your React app. So that's what that restriction is coming from. Strict mode says, nope, you can't use certain things. We're just gonna enforce it right off the bat. So if I got rid of strict mode, I think I would have more leniency. I'm not gonna mess with that, but I think that is the origin of why we can't use kind of syntax we're used to. All right, so again, methods don't need a function keyword. You simply do this business. Questions? Yeah, I know it's not very interesting.
Yeah.
Again, with this in place, I've changed 2 components to be class-based components. Let's see if our functionality has changed at all.
Actually, I had a question real quick about about that render function. So
Sure.
is that an anonymous function then?
It's not anonymous, it's called render. So you can imagine there's a function keyword here. The name of this function is render, but we're just not using the function keyword.
Because I saw a video or something one time that said with JavaScript functions, if you have a class and you have a regular function inside that class, and it uses the this keyword, then outside of that class, if you have an instance and you try to invoke that function that uses this keyword, then it doesn't recognize this. It will only work with like the fat arrow functions. Is
Yeah.
that true? Like if you created a mute button and then outside of this class you tried to do whatever that mute button name is .render, it wouldn't recognize this .props? Like it would have a problem executing this, or no?
Yes. So yes, you're tapping into kind of a more advanced part about class-based components, and it is good to go over. So I'm kind of glad you brought that up. So let's actually explore that with an example, but it looks like my mute button broke, so I need to quickly figure that out. Maybe just kill my server. See if I have any errors here. Hopefully I didn't forget anything. All right, starting development server. It looks like I have 1 warning, but everything else, yeah, okay. Looks like I just need to restart my app. But again, I converted all my components to class-based components. Functionality did not change at all. So if I still click this, still works as before. However, there is one thing that I want to mention. So you can use functional-based components mixed in with class-based components. So I could have, converted my mute button to class-based components and left my app component as a functional-based component. It's going to work totally fine. Now, with that said, you can mix and match. You probably shouldn't, right? Just pick one and stick with it. So if you want to use functional-based components, use those. That's kind of the newer way to do it. If you want to use class-based components for something, that's fine. So make sure you stick to that. Don't kind of mix and match, because that's going to drive other developers crazy. But Jake brought up a great point, and that's something I want to explore here. So I actually don't have, so let's actually talk about this. So I'm going to introduce that event handler that I took away earlier to bring up a very important point about class-based components. This is only for class-based components. Function-based components kind of circumvent this. But if I have an event handler, and this was called toggle mute, if I create it this way, like a normal function, notice this is not an anonymous function, not a fat arrow function. Creating a function, I'm going to move my logic to toggle this. So let's get rid of this. Toggle mute, we'll call toggle mute. Notice I got to use this .toggle mute. Always have the this keyword. I often forget it. You'll run into errors if you don't use the this keyword. It's not going to know what toggle mute you're referring to. So make sure you're using your this keywords in a class-based component. Looks like I got some issues here. Okay, so we have toggle mute, which is a separate function now that I'm creating like this. I'm going to drop in the logic I had before. So we're just going to call this dot state is muted. All right, we're going to toggle the state of is muted, and that's what's being done right here. And we need my parentheses. All right, so this is what I have here. Will this work? Let's try this out. Okay. Notice not working anymore. I'm clicking this button. Icon's not updating. Notice my text not showing up. What happened here? Why isn't this working? So notice I have an error in my console. Every time I click this, I get a new error. If I clear this, notice I get an error. Cannot read properties undefined. So this is where, again, reading error messages can kind of clue you into maybe what's going on. So notice it says it's trying to read set state, but you're calling set state on something that's undefined. That's what this error message is saying. So where are we calling set state? This is on, let's see if the error message says toggle mute. So app.js line 19, I believe. Let's take a look at that. So line 19, yep, that is where I'm calling set state. So I'm calling set state, but it's complaining that whatever I'm calling set state on is undefined. Why is this happening? Well, this is kind of more of the intricacies of JavaScript. This keyword right here is not referring to the instance. It's referring to whoever called into that function. So in this case, it's the window. It's not even the window object. It's not the instance of the class is the key takeaway here. So this keyword right here is not referring to the instance based on the way it was called. It was called from somewhere else. So this keyword is referring to that other place. So the quick solution here, and this is why you want to use fat arrow functions basically all the time in class-based components, is if you make this an anonymous function, so I set this equal to a fat arrow function, now my code will work correctly. Anonymous functions, by default, they will capture wherever they're defined. So this keyword referred to wherever this anonymous function was defined, which is in my app component. So this keyword will be appropriately mapped to the instance of app that we're using. And it's very complicated. The simple answer is just always use fat arrow function, and you won't have to worry about this. So if I do it this way, go back to my code, refresh. Notice it works now. I get currently muted. I get the icon. I need to figure out what this warning is about, but yeah, so this works now. So again, it's very kind of complicated to understand, but if you use fat arrow functions, this keyword would automatically be what you expect it to be. If you do not use fat arrow functions, again, just have a standard function like this. It's not gonna be obvious that there's something wrong, but this keyword is not referring to what you think it's gonna refer to. So I think Jake was saying, well, here I have a normal function. Yeah, in this case, it's fine. I'm using this, and it's going to refer to the proper this because I'm not calling this from outside of the function or outside of the class, sorry. If we did call this from like some other place, this keyword might not be what we want it to be. I know that's very complicated. There are other ways to solve this. If you are curious, instead of always using fat arrow functions, you could bind functions. So something bind react constructor. Yeah, this is way more complicated than you need to worry about. But I just want to make sure you can understand how to fix this. So in your constructor of your component class, you can bind functions. This is, again, more advanced that we really need to know about, but you can do this, whatever your function you want, call the bind method and pass it this. If you do it this way, then you could use this handle click function and use whatever, you could use this keyword inside the handle click function and have it work as you expect it. Again, that's super complicated. If you're like, what, I have no idea what he's talking about. Simple takeaway here is always use fat arrow functions and you'll never have to think about this twice. Just always use fat arrow functions for your event handlers. And again, it doesn't hurt. I could use a fat arrow function here. I don't need to in this case, but if I wanted to get in the habit of it, sure. Create anonymous functions all the time. And this should work without issue. All right, so that's the main caveat of using class-based components. You need to use fat arrow functions to kind of circumvent this weird issue of this keyword not referring to the right thing. But yeah, those are class-based components. So again, you're gonna potentially deal with this, in your professional life. for our curriculum, we're mostly going to be using functional-based components. So if you're going to focus on one, focus on learning functional-based components. But with that said, it is important to understand class-based components. And if you encounter them, shouldn't throw you off. You should understand, all right, there's just another way to write a component. It's still doing the core pieces of using state values, using prop values, rendering something. Nothing of that has changed with our class-based component here. Right? We still have our state values. We still have a way to update our state values. We still have our rendering. The core functionality of our component is still there. What questions do you guys have? No questions? It all made sense? All right. If there are no questions, I guess we'll get